Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Anthropology 310, Origins of Human Diversity. It's Friday of week 7. It's 4th of October. Nice. Let's see. Check the syllabus. We are rapidly approaching the middle of the semester. Next week is midterms. We're going to have a little bit different. We're going to start on the Upper Paleolithic. We'll be hanging out in the Upper Paleolithic for a little bit of time, for 2 weeks, more or less. But that is cut up. Next week's going to be kind of a weird week. So I split it into kind of Upper Paleolithic introduction, which we'll do on Monday. And then we'll talk a lot. We'll actually, let me finish that. So on Monday, we'll kind of introduce the Upper Paleolithic, in which, spoiler alert, we modern humans take over the world and push out or outcompete or interbreed with all the other species, and we're the last human standing. Spoiler. So, if you didn't know already, we are also going to have our test number 1 in here. Test number 1 is on Canvas. This is like an artifact of the COVID era. We used to like sit in here and listen to lo-fi together and take scantrons. We don't do that anymore. I will reserve a room. Actually, we won't, because we will have class on Friday. But if you do, so everything's on Canvas. You can take it whenever you'd like. You can even take it today. It should be open. We will have a review that will be next Wednesday. We're just shuffle things around. But your test isn't due till Friday, so you can take it kind of whenever. On Friday of next week, so Monday we'll introduce the Upper Paleolithic. Wednesday we'll do our review. And Friday we're going to have a guest lecture from Art, Dr. Francolino. He teaches art history here. On Monday we'll talk a little bit about kind of one of the major inventions during the Upper Paleolithic is art. And so we'll have an honest to goodness art history teacher coming on Friday and talk to you about some of the significance of the kind of cave art and some of the other things that we see during this era. And then in week 9, we'll kind of continue our discussion of the Upper Paleolithic, kind of finish up what we were talking about, and then talk about peopling of the world and how people got to different places. Like I said, we do have test number 1 coming up, and the review sheet should be posted next week. Yep, study guide, it's already posted. So you can check out that if you want to kind of get ahead on your test. Remember, midterm grades are also due, not this weekend, but next weekend for me. So anything that you would like to be included in your midterm grade, for whatever reason, for most people, midterm grades are just kind of like, oh, this is how you're doing in the class. But if you're an athlete, if you're on scholarship or anything like that, that depends on you having a certain grade, please turn in any work. Don't just go by like Canvas calculation. It'll tell you, oh, you have an 87. Get your midterm grade. Like, what do I have a C? It's because if there's no zeros put in there, it won't add that to the calculation. We try to give you an opportunity to turn things in before we put zeros in, but some people need a little bit of motivation, and seeing that 0 will help. So we were going to put zeros in this weekend for things that you're missing. Don't feel like that's just your final grade, though. That just helps us with calculations. And if you still want to turn those things in to get points, please do. Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
Choice, or do you have one written?
It is mostly multiple choice. I think I have it written on here. I believe so. Let's see. Just pull it up right now. Actually, it's not going to tell me. It looks like, I think it's, what the study guide says. It's mostly multiple choice. It's like, what's this? 60 something multiple choice questions, 2 matching or ordering, like which came first, this or this, and then 3 essay type questions. I think that's what currently it's. I'll check that, but that's what it was last year. So mostly multiple choice, because it's really hard to grade a lot of people's essays if you have just a ton of them. So a lot of these, we'll go over that on Wednesday. We'll do, for those of you in my other class, we play the bell game where we do like a game show, and you can learn the answers and win fabulous prizes like extra credit. All right, any other questions? Okay, so if you remember, you got a quiz this week, and one of your quiz questions was asking about Homo floresiensis, and we're actually going to talk about that today. Pull that up real quick. We've talked about Homo erectus, we've talked about Neanderthals. So now we're going to talk about Homo floresiensis as well as the Denisovans today. So let's jump right into it. Okay. So last time we talked, I kind of showed you this model of the braided stream, right? Homo erectus, we talked about left Africa, settled just basically everywhere in the old world. Here's kind of a map of where people are going. Basically leaves Africa and splits off as they go into these different places around the world, starts to form different populations. Again, it's kind of been debatable whether these are different species or subspecies or just kind of different varieties of humans. I think subspecies is probably where we end up landing based on the genetic evidence that there are these distinct populations, but they are not separate species because they have the ability to interbreed and have viable offspring. Homo erectus leaves Africa, goes to different places around the world, and basically starts to speciate or subspeciate. We see Neanderthals over here in Europe and into kind of the Caucasus and up and towards like this area of Siberia. And we're going to talk about two other groups from Asia, the Denisovans, which were recently found over here in Siberia, as well as in Tibet and kind of northern Cambodia, as well as the Floriensis people from the islands down in here. And for a long time, this wasn't as well known. Like we saw last time with the Neanderthals, these have been known for over 150, 170 years at this point. But these two discoveries, and we might even get to a third one with Homo lusiensis over in the Philippines, but I don't think we'll have time today, are much more recent, all since 2000 or so. So really, kind of Asia was kind of a neglected side of kind of human origin story, but we're increasingly kind of filling in the puzzle. So that's what we're going to focus in on today. Everything from this line over. Yeah, so we do Neanderthals. We'll do Homo floresiensis, lusiensis, and some Denisovians today. And next week we will we'll talk about Homo sapiens and where they came from. Okay, we talked about Neanderthals, lots of Neanderthals. What's some take-home points that you got from Neanderthals? What's interesting about them, or why do we talk about them? Beyond just being the next checkbox on my list of things.
I just learned that they're not just like.
Yeah, I think they are people. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, but they have emotion too, or they're like sympathetic. They have feelings.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So next time somebody calls you a Neanderthal, you'd be like, "Oh, I'm like a very sensitive, caring kind of individual, right?" Yeah. Yeah, and I think between their technology, the ability to move into these really cold climates, which humans had never done before, so you need the technology of like clothing or these ponchos or something like that, these kind of new tool technologies, and then burying their dead and taking care of old people, I think is really indicative of their humanity. So like we saw, I just said, Neanderthals were a big part of kind of our understanding of this middle Paleolithic time period. And it's stretched, we think of them primarily in Europe, but we see them all throughout kind of the Near East and the Levant and Persia or Iran today, and all the way up here to kind of central area, especially this site called Denisova, which is really interesting, and it's going to be a nice segue into our next discussion. For a long time, there's been finds over here. This is a site kind of in Russia, and much like our site at in Georgia that we talked about last week with Dmanisi, a lot of this kind of research was held back during the Cold War because you have the United States and the Soviet Union not really getting along, even if it comes to matters of science. This has been kind of an identified cave where Neanderthals were living, as well as later modern humans, one of those like really deep time periods. But with the advent of kind of genetic testing in the early 2000s, scientists realized there was more going on in this cave maybe than they initially realized. And genetic evidence pointed to a new type of hominid, probably similar to Neanderthals, but genetically distinct, what we would call today the Denisovan or the Denisovans. This is Denisovan Cave. It's located right here at this kind of almost four-way meet between China, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia. And for a while, it was the only place where these had been identified. But more recently, there's a site in China, kind of towards the Tibetan Plateau, and then kind of down here in Southeast Asia, where similar materials have been found. And again, this is the idea that when Homo erectus left Africa, those that were over here turned into Neanderthals, and those that turned over here turned into something else, like the Denisovans. And so I'm going to show you a video about the Denisovans, and then actually let me talk to you just a little bit more, and then I'll show you the video. This is this cave. Bear Rock is what it's known, Bear Rock Cave, and it's got lots of paleological or archaeological and paleontological, so Ice Age mammoths and bears and things like that. This is a really complicated site, and at different layers, there seems to be different populations living here. Everything from modern humans to Neanderthals to Denisovans, and even, we'll find out, spoiler alert, some hybrids living there at the same time, people with more than one subspecies as a parent. It's also an interesting site because archaeologists have claimed it's one of the earliest sites of finding sewing needles at a site. It's definitely the oldest in Asia. There's some question about whether there's one in Africa that's older, but it's really old. And it shows us what? What do needles show us? Sewing needles, not like.
They have the ability to like create technology needed to do.
Yeah, so they're creating technology to make something else, these kind of intermediate tools. And what are you making with needles? Especially if you're living in Siberia. This looks really green here. But yeah, clothes. It gets cold in the winter. And we don't see until modern humans kind of like tailored clothes like we would see, but definitely something's going on making ponchos or making some kind of warm clothes with their needles. And so in 2008, a scientist, Savante Pabo, did some DNA research on these fossils. These fossils had been found for a couple of years already, and many of them had been attributed to Neanderthals. Because morphologically, they were very similar to what we were seeing in Europe. They were slightly different, but people tended to, at that time, kind of like group them all together. But when they actually ran the DNA from these fossils, they found that there were actually population differences, even within the same cave. It looked like there were multiple populations or subspecies living in this cave at different times, possibly even overlapping it. And what they found, which was really interesting, was because it was the first time really that a new human species had been identified, not using just the bones, but using kind of this DNA, looking at the differences in DNA between the different specimens. And so the new subspecies was known as the Denisovans. So I'm going to show you a video about the Denisovans who lived about anywhere between 190,000 to about 30,000 years ago, and how they have, even though they are no longer with us, how their genetic legacy lives on today. So that was a video about Denisovans. I think it's really interesting just how recent a lot of this research is. When I was in undergrad, like you in 2000, 2003, there was this feeling like we had found most of the fossils, right? Or, they found the Neanderthals and they found Homo erectus and Homo habilis, like what else are you going to find? But really with the advent of genetic testing, it's really opened up a lot of new avenues for understanding human past. Yeah, so while the original fossils that they found, those finger bones and molars were dated to about 75 to about 300,000. Recently, there has been more individuals found. It's the Denisova cave up here. There's also been one from Laos down here and in China. A lot of what is actually being found, so to speak, is not through new excavations, but it's actually going back to some of these old excavations and genetically testing things that were labeled as Neanderthals to make sure they were actually Neanderthals and weren't of this different Denisovan population. We find a little bit of evidence for culture, but like you saw in the video, it's still kind of sparse. We find evidence for stone tool making and use, processing of animal remains as food, but also using them as raw materials, as hides, as blankets and clothes and stuff like that. There's a lot of overlap between Denisovan and Neanderthals. One DNA test between them shows that they have a lot of overlap, while modern humans, they've 2% of Neanderthals or 4% at most of Denisovans. Denisovans and Neanderthals shared up to 17% of their DNA, which is why it seems like it was easy for them to interbreed with each other. But they were distinct. Like Neanderthals, Denisovans are thought to have dark skin, dark eyes, dark hair, kind of this Neanderthal build, short and stocky. But there are differences. They seem to have larger molars than Neanderthals or modern humans. Much more similar to some of these archaic forms. So maybe they're using their teeth, they're eating more tough material, or they're using their teeth to like process things. We see this with like modern Inuit populations, people using their teeth as like tools for processing hides or making seal skins softer or things like that. We find a lot of evidence, like you saw in the video, Austronesians, so people, and Melanesians, people who live in kind of the Pacific Islands, and Australia kind of area, tend to have the most of the Denisovan DNA today. One really interesting case is this fossil called Denisova 11. It's a 13-year-old female, and she has a mother that is a Neanderthal and a father that's a Denisovan. So it shows that not only were these, because there's always this question, are these different types of hominids inhabiting the same cave at the same time, or is like, you know, it looks like kind of a blip in the archaeological record, but it could be hundreds of years between when you showed up in the next group. It does seem like there is at least some kind of peaceful interaction in which you have hybrid individuals between these different species. Bless you.
Thank you.
Okay. And so that's really super new. I mean, it's the last 15 years or so. But there has been a lot of other new types of species. Two more that we'll talk about briefly, we'll at least talk about one of them, are down here kind of in the near Southeast Asia, bless you, kind of near Pacific. We're kind of moving east here, right? While Denisovans are up here and here and here. Once we get down here, again, the picture gets a little bit murky. The theory is, again, that there are Homo erectuses who leave Africa and spread out throughout all over the old world. The ones that are in Asia, there's some question about these are, you know, the older ones look kind of really Homo erectus-like, while some of the later ones tend to have these different, almost Neanderthal-like features. And until we get out to the islands, then things get kind of weird. And again, this is all really recent, like 2005, 2008 on, 2010 on. These ones in the Philippines are really recent, like 2016 or 17 onwards. And we're starting to find that Homo erectus was much more prolific traveler than we ever knew. Again, even when I was in college and things like that. And two new species have been found over here. This is the island of Flores, right here, where almost right where it says the Wallace line, just beyond the Wallace line, little island right there, as well as a different species found over here in the island of Luzon in the Philippines. We'll take a look at my favorite first, the Homo floriensis. I don't have a floriensis skull. Let me go grab that really quick. That'll be more entertaining. Actually, I'll get it later. Show the video. Sorry. On this island of Flores, this is the island of Flores in Indonesia. Scientists have found a new creature, a new hominid, right? Called Homo floriensis. And while we've looked at Neanderthals and Denisovans or Denisovans and say, well, these are kind of really interesting and different. Homo floriensis is real out there. The probably most distinguishing characteristic of them is their size. They're very small. They're only about 3 foot tall. So I have a 3-year-old child, 3'3". So we're talking about this high, right? For fully grown humans. It's kind of really interesting. This is the island of Flores, and it was found in this cave right here called Lung Bao Cave. There it is right there. And not only were bones found, there also was stone tools and possibly evidence of fire. So even though these creatures looked very strange and don't look very human at all in some ways, they're very small hominids with small brains. They seem to be kind of have these same kind of cultural characteristics, right? The theory is that Homo erectus traveled all the way to Java or to kind of the eastern or western side of Indonesia, and then kind of diverged. And especially when we're talking about island populations, we tend to see dwarf creatures, especially dwarf mammals. So for instance, on the island of Flores, we have dwarf elephants, little pygmy elephants like this, right? They're about 4 foot tall. They're adorable. We find other kinds of shrunken creatures on island. In the Florida Keys, we find key deer, which are really small. They're deer which have become dwarf. And there's this, the theory is that these are Homo erectus who moved onto an island, and because of the pressure, ecological pressure with living on an island, with kind of having limited resources, that it tends to favor smaller bodies, especially in mammals. On the other hand, we do see some of these giant creatures like giant rodents and giant Komodo dragons on the island as well. So it leads to questions about what these creatures were doing and how they were surviving. I'm going to show you this video. Yeah.
Were dragons always big?
Well, they were bigger than they are today. They have
Back in
been.
the old years?
Yeah, even before like the 1700s, because most of the really big ones were hunted out by Dutch sailors. So I'm going to show you this video, and I'm going to grab my Floriensis skull, and I'll pass that around as we're watching this video, and you can just kind of see some of the difference between why this might be a super interesting creature on our family tree. So I've been passing around the Floriensis skull, and you can just kind of see how different it is. Where did it go? Cool. And if you take a look at it, and I also have this, our more rectus skull, you can see that this actually has a lot in common with the Floriensis, right? Especially while it's much smaller. It does have a very similar shaped brain. It's kind of low and flat. Behind here, this is the brow a little bit right here. So a lot of these kind of characteristics that we see in Homo erectus, which is kind of much smaller. Time, let's do it. And like you saw in the video, they're really small brain, smaller than chimpanzee size brain, but also kind of very small body. But not only was it smaller in terms of absolute size, in terms of cubic centimeters, but it's different shape and seems to be organized differently. Here's our human brain, endocast of a modern human brain versus the Floriensis. You can see it's kind of smaller, more pancake shaped and kind of wider, versus ours is more rounded out. But it does seem like they were still doing technological things, making stone tools, having fire, many of these things which we would associate with kind of modern humans. The other thing I think is super interesting about them is just how recently they lived. While a lot of, we talk about Neanderthals and Denisovans, these are very similar. They were kind of coexisting at the same time as modern humans. We're going to kind of pick up the story of modern Homo sapiens next week, how they left Africa and went to all these different places. And we find, like you saw in the video, Floriensis existing really, really late in prehistory, right? Like still existing at the time that humans are moving into North America and Australia and things like that. Just before the time, it's only a few thousand years before the invention of agriculture and some of the first, kind of large cities or megaliths that start going up in the Near East. So right at the cusp of the modern era, which shocked scientists, right? You expected these things to be 500,000 years old or something, not like 18,000 or 15,000 years ago. And especially to live on the island of Flores, which is a pretty small island, for over 30,000 years with modern humans, right? So these are really interesting, this kind of coexistence. And people often, ethnographers like myself in cultural anthropology are really interested in kind of the cultural stories that the people on the island have about these kind of little people, which for a long time were seen as like superstition, or isn't that like a quaint little myth you people have? But now increasingly people are thinking this is like somehow encoding this cultural knowledge about when people on the island of Flores used to share space with Floriensis. Unlike Denisovans and Neanderthals, we don't find any evidence genetically of mixture between Floriensis and Homo sapiens. It could be that they're just so short and work big because it just doesn't work. Pieces and parts don't match. Or it could be that we've only found like 7 or 8 of these Homo floriensis, and we haven't found the right individual yet. And testing is expensive and it's ongoing and still new. So maybe by the time that you are a professor of paleoanthropology, you'll be able to share with your students more interesting facts about these creatures. Last one, just in 2007, another species was discovered over in the Philippines, Homo lusiensis. There's not much known about this. It's kind of preliminary discoveries. We're over here, right here in these kind of near Pacific islands. And it seems to be another species descended from Homo erectus, in which they kind of move onto these islands and start to speciate or start to be different populations. We have teeth evidence, we have a little bit of skull evidence, And again, this is kind of a reconstruction of what they would look like. A little bit more prognathic, a little bit smaller. One of the interesting features about them is they seem to have longer arms than we do. And especially longer fingers. And there's some hypothesis that these were either still had these kind of adaptations to climbing up into trees for sleeping at night, or they kind of re-evolved those being on the island. But it's kind of, again, very preliminary kind of stuff. There's the cave where those bones were found. The big picture, though, is that for a long time, we thought that, Neanderthals were the only species of kind of Homo erectus descendant out there, but now it seems like there's a whole bunch of them, and genetic evidence is showing us that it's kind of more complex picture than we originally thought. And also that these creatures didn't just live like way back, they often lived pretty close into the lived well into the upper Paleolithic, right almost to the edge of the Neolithic in some parts of the world, and that they interacted with modern humans for tens of thousands of years. And some of that interaction is encoded in our modern DNA, and some of it's in kind of our cultural memory of interacting with other species. So next week, we're going to kind of pick up the thread in the upper Paleolithic, in which modern humans become the only living hominid on planet Earth. So we'll see how we go from 4 or 5 different species of hominids about 50,000 years ago to, by 10,000 years or so ago, Homo sapiens being the only ones left. How did that process happen? Okay, that's it for today. We are out of time. Enjoy homecoming weekend. Remember, if you have anything you want to turn in for midterm grades to be included in your grade, please turn that in this weekend and I'll get it graded and post it to your grade. So thanks so much for hanging out today, and I'll see you next week.